Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's Youth Apprenticeship Works Office Hour, which is supported by funding through the U.S. Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration's Youth Apprenticeship Intermediaries Project. Today's discussion topic is employer engagement strategies, and this session will be recorded. Thus, please keep your phone muted if you're not the primary speaker for best call quality. With this, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andrea Matthew, who is our JFF director, who will tell you a little bit more about the project and today's session. Andrea?
Sorry to mute myself. Hi, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well. I can see that we're getting snow. Jerry is acknowledging that into the chat box. It's nice to meet everybody. So as Cassandra mentioned, I am the director in the Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning, and I am leading the Youth Apprenticeship Intermediary Contract, and I'm also one of the national partners in the Partnership to Advance Youth Apprenticeship. So this is our first community of practice session. So you are helping us prototype this. We are trying to build out a community of practice virtual space and a community space where we meet virtually under the moniker of Youth Apprenticeship Works. And we are hoping that today can be a robust discussion. Although we ask that you keep yourself on mute while others are talking, we do hope that you'll take yourself off of mute and on camera to ask questions and to make this a really robust conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to Jerry Ghazi, who's going to talk to us a little bit about employer engagement and then engage in the conversation.
Great, thank you. And it's great to have everybody. It looks like we have 26 participants on the call. A lot of familiar names. I want to say hi to everyone out there that knows me. I really appreciate you spending the time today. And I really want to make this interactive. So if you don't feel comfortable unmuting your phone and just cutting me off, but if you feel comfortable, do that, please. Otherwise, if you don't mind, just put your questions in the chat box and we'll have people monitoring them. And Cassandra will be kind enough to cut me off in the middle of anything so that I can answer your questions, because it's really important to go back and forth. I've covered these we have 2 slides we're going to cover today, and it's really something that I've been doing, for the last several years in trying to instill in those that are really interested in registered apprenticeship, how to approach the sales cycle with employer partners, right? And the very first thing I always say in these kind of talks with folks in a dialogue is that apprenticeship is an action verb. And apprenticeship truly just means employee development. So it's an employee development strategy that has a structure around it that takes an employee from one point of competence, normally it's with no competence, to full competence in a particular occupation, right? So it's an action, and that action is made up of several components. And we always talk about the 5 components of an apprenticeship, the 5 actions that take place. And one of the most important things when describing an apprenticeship program to an employer is to talk in their language. So talk in a way in which, and communicate to them in a way in which you're really not referring to an apprenticeship as a product or as an end result or as a noun, but you're talking about it as an employee development solution, right? Something that they can and may already be undertaking. Many, many times we talk about putting a wrapper around an existing employee development program that an employer has in place. And they've been doing it. They've been doing onboarding for the longest period of time, and they have a structured way of doing that. How to bring someone into their organization, right, who may not be fully competent, and then provide them the necessary components of experience and education that brings them to full mastery of the position they were hired in for, right? And so we constantly are talking about apprenticeship as an action verb and what an employer is already familiar with doing. So if you kind of frame any kind of conversation, even your initial ones, with an employer in terms of their language and what they're already doing, then apprenticeship is easily folded into the conversation in the latter part when they're saying, well, I'm having issues or challenges with this piece of it or that piece of my employee development strategy for bringing on either new employees or upskilling existing ones. How could you help workforce board? How could you help training provider? How could you help sponsor of an apprenticeship. Help me, the employer. So what I want to do is just briefly cover on this first slide. There are 5 components of an apprenticeship, right? The first thing is there is always, and this is the inner circle, there's always business involvement, right? In order to have a registered apprenticeship, you must have an employee. The individual apprentice, in order to be called an apprentice, must be employed. And they typically are a W-2 employee. They're not a contractor, they're not a 1099, but they're a W-2 employee. And that's the first component. So you're always looking for opportunities where employers want to employ individuals versus bring them on as temporary, maybe 1099 contractors, which are fully competent. A 1099 contractor is an individual who should be able to operate independent of that employer to fulfill whatever the employer's requirements are. But I go back to that business involvement, right? And businesses do this all the time, right? They are hiring all the time, right? So if you look in the outside of that chart, you'll see business need to either hire or promote staff within. They're growing their current staff. So incumbent workers can be a target of that business involvement, that first component of apprenticeship. And we've created over the years numerous programs where we're doing upskilling apprenticeships. You're taking one individual, example would be, let's say, a software engineer, that they're fully competent as a software engineer, but they need to be upskilled into cyber technology so that when they're coding, they're actually basically coding in a way that is secure. So we created an apprenticeship for a cyber engineer or a cyber architect, and that individual who's already an employee of the organization can be upskilled through that apprenticeship, right? We mostly associate apprenticeships with people coming on board. That's new. And a lot of times we misassociate apprenticeships for the positions that are just entry level. And truly, an apprenticeship could be used at any level of position, even if it's a new employee. So we've actually drafted and had registered and employees enter an engineering, an aerospace engineering apprenticeship program. So they are in college, maybe they're in the 3rd or 4th year of a college degree in engineering, and they enter an apprenticeship with an employer, and they get onboarded as an apprentice, right? So very high level skill set there. Same with cybersecurity. So the first thing, business involvement, is always key. And you can see businesses have a need and will continually have a need to hire new staff or promote internal staff. So the first element of an apprenticeship is usually there with an employer. The second element is that once an employer does hire, right, they usually have a resume. Let's say it's a new person. They have that person's resume and they have the job description. And when they're doing the whole interviewing process and selection process for an employee, right, there's always a skills gap. They never find the perfect match, right? So what they do is they're willing to create a learning plan for this new individual, new employee coming in, to give them the additional education they may need, additional related instruction they may need, right? To get them the knowledge base so they can perform within the organization. And that knowledge comes from a whole host of different places, right? The second component of an apprenticeship is related instruction. It's instruction related to the occupation itself, so the person has the knowledge to perform the tasks. And that's the second element of an apprenticeship. And in the onboarding process for new staff, there's usually a process in which an employer takes an individual into their organization and provides them instruction. It may be on the systems they're currently using, it may be on the hardware or software they're using, et cetera, to fill in any gaps that that individual doesn't have, now presented on their resume as a new hire. So employers are very, very familiar with having to fill knowledge gaps, right? By sending individuals to outside classes, et cetera. You go on to the third element of an apprenticeship, which is now that they have knowledge, right? They need to apply that knowledge in a structured way, right? They're going to apply it to the job responsibilities that this individual apprentice needs to perform. Well, that happens every day outside of an apprenticeship, right? Individuals are constantly creating work experiences, right? So, I mean, if we think about it yourself, every time you perform a new task or perform the same task, but in a new situation, you're creating a new work experience for yourself, right? Well, in an apprenticeship program, it's structured, right? We call that the work process schedule. It's a schedule of tasks that the individual must complete in a competent way in order to sign off, right? Same with the related instruction. It's an outline of instruction that the individual must take, and it's all forms of taking it, so that they gain the knowledge necessary to apply that knowledge to a structured experience. And that structured experience comes with mentoring. And a lot of times an employer says, well, I can't afford to have a mentor sit by Mary or Joe all day long. And that's not the case at all. The mentoring part of an apprenticeship, just like the mentoring part on the job outside of an apprenticeship, is that there is a resource, a senior level resource that is available to guide the individual when they're trying to apply newfound knowledge, new gained knowledge from the related instruction to the task at hand, right? And you have that at employer. And some employers are very sophisticated in their mentoring programs, right? They always pair you up with a team leader or a supervisor or a manager that has the knowledge base, not only to supervise you, but also the knowledge base of the subject matter to help guide you through those work processes. So employers do that because they have to fill a gap, right? They never just hire someone, throw them on the floor and hope for the best. They usually are overseen by some multiple individuals that are helping that individual grow in that occupation they've been hired for the position outside of an apprenticeship. Apprenticeship just puts a formal structure around it, right? So you have business involvement, which is the hiring. You have the related instruction, which is the skills gaps being filled. You have the structured on-the-job training, which is applying any new knowledge gained by filling those skill gaps to the work processes of the job, to the job responsibilities. These are one and the same that employers do with their employees all the time in any kind of employee development program, right? And once you have 2 and 3 happening in cycles, one after the other, in combination, person becomes more valuable to the organization, right? In an apprenticeship, that value is demonstrated by a structure of wage gains or wage increases over the course of the apprenticeship. Well, employers do that anyway with their employees. They conduct performance reviews. And those performance reviews usually and typically are merit-based increases, as are the skills and rewards gained in an apprenticeship. So when you talk about, performance reviews and reward increases and have conversations with an employer, right, you're using their language, but you're knowing that you're able to actually meet the rewards for skills gain, right? Element of the 5 elements, that 4th element. And then finally, we have that last element, which is a national credential, right? So you have this in an apprenticeship, the individual receives a national occupational credential. They basically are no longer considered an apprentice. They're considered fully competent in the occupation. Well, that happens all the time in the business world, right? So once you continually prove yourself and you go through several, maybe review processes where you're becoming more and more competent to that employer, this is outside of apprenticeship, just generally happens. Eventually, you may actually hit the ceiling of performance for one level in that position you're in, and you may get promoted to the next level. So employers are used to promoting internal staff, growing and developing their internal staff. And when they move to that new level, an individual is usually conferred a new job title, right? So when you look on their resume, you may see a series of job titles, even your own resume, at the same employer. Each one of those steps is like a mini apprenticeship where you actually work through it. You had to gain new knowledge, you gained new experiences, you became confident, and then you got promoted to the next level. Well, that promotion in the apprenticeship world is considered, it's manifested by this national occupational credential. So we have these 5 components of apprenticeship, and we have these 5 elements that employers are already doing. So I'm going to pause here, and I want to ask the group, can you put a question that I just talked about? Does this make sense to you? Do you find these conversations, or have you had conversations with employers using their language? It would be helpful to know. So I'm going to call on folks if you don't mind, because I actually have my participants window open. So Gert, you're out there, and you've always helped me out in the past. So I'm gonna ask you for a lifeline here. Do you have any questions around what you're seeing right now and how you can apply it?
You always do this to me, huh? Okay. Well,
You always sell me out in the past. This even displays.
well, this is what we studied before, right? It's the same thing that we were studying before.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I don't really have too much of a question. I do, or I'm able to now speak more in the business language. So that was really helpful to me. Other than that, I think I have a pretty good understanding of this chart. I actually studied it a couple of times. I can
Excellent.
understand what it actually meant.
And I think we distributed this to the folks that they use it on sales calls, right? So when you're out there and you're talking about it with an employer, you're really going around the outer level, right? Or the outer rim, talking about business needs. Do they hire? Do they promote? When they bring someone on, how do they onboard someone? Those are all questions that you're gaining information on.
Mhm.
Um,
And the other
it's,
part you were saying that we would do the research on the actual company so we can get a good understanding of them when we're talking, right?
absolutely, yes. And you can see where their hiring needs are, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can see how long things have been posted for. You know, those jobs that have been out there a long time, they're probably having a real hard time finding the perfect resume, right? So there's probably a large skills gap. And you can capitalize on that as a part of a dialogue and a conversation with that employer to say, you know, it looks like this posting has been out here for 6 months. Are you having trouble finding resumes? Have you considered building the person, like lowering the credentials that you're looking for and then building them as an employee of your organization, giving them the instruction they need, right, as well as the work experiences they would need to become fully competent. So that's great that you're actually able to talk that language and use these charts, hopefully, in sales calls.
Yes, they do help, I must admit.
Excellent.
So, Jerry, I have a question. What
Sure.
has been historically one of the biggest oppositions that employers have had to formalizing their already their employee training process and moving it into an actual apprenticeship?
I think once we start introducing the term apprenticeship, employers believe there is a different connotation between at-will employment and something that now has become a mandatory employment, right? So one of the biggest obstacles that helps an employer overcome that is a deeper understanding by the employer that, you know, all employment, right, depending on your state, I should say, is employment at will, right? And all employees can be terminated for cause, right? And it's no different with the apprenticeships, right? The apprenticeships is just a category of an employee where when you're looking at their competence level, it's non-existent at the beginning and you're bringing them to full existence. But the minute you start talking about apprenticeship, they think it's a different relationship than their normal employment relationship. And it does establish, you know, through the standards, certain responsibilities of the apprentice and certain responsibilities of the employer, right? But those would be in existence regardless if you tried to bring a person on who had no competency, right? And then you said, I'm going to bring you and train you to be X, Y, and Z. Well, they're making a commitment to that training. Well, that's just formalized in the related instruction, right? So it's helping the individual or the employer understand that what's already occurring and what they're already doing is part of it. Most of my conversations have to do with explaining the language and the standards and basically showing them that they're already doing it, right? That they already have that in place within their organization. The other great challenge is sometimes for smaller organizations, they feel they don't have the infrastructure to support an apprenticeship because they think it's really burdensome, right? And I try to allude to the fact that, well, you don't have to take the full responsibility of the program management and administration. You can find an intermediary that will register you as an employer under their standards and let you focus on two of the key elements, which is the related instruction or, you know, the knowledge transfer and the mentoring. And if they say, well, we have no instructors, and that's where your intermediary can bring in community colleges, third-party training providers. So you should always have in your back pocket, as you're asking those questions on the 5 core elements, if there is resistance to anyone, how could you help that employer overcome the barriers that they perceive are there. Because many times those perceived barriers aren't reality. It's just a perception, right? And you can help them see a different reality. This next slide, and it's funny, Gert, that you actually said speak their language, right? So this is the most important thing, is that when you're working within the framework of an apprenticeship, you know certain items like outreach and reselection, work processes and competency, related technical instruction. That's going to be meaningless to employers, right? So you have to be able to, as you're diving in for the first time, researching that employer, and then having those first conversations, you're really not bringing up apprenticeship as the solution. What you're bringing up is an employee development model to test their appetite, right? You're trying to go around all 5 elements and ask what pain points they're feeling in any of them, right? So, right, the first pain points is the whole recruitment and interviewing, right? I noticed you have a job posting out there for 6 months. How many resumes did you receive? Based on those resumes, how many interviews did you conduct? And how many of that pool did you find that's worthwhile even to extend an offer or take it to the second level? You might find a whole pain point around recruitment and interviewing, that they're just not bringing in candidates. And it could be for 1 or 2 reasons. One is that the employer themselves is looking for something that's just not a perfect match, and they'll never find the perfect match. And that's a great opening for you to say, hey, have you considered reducing the qualifications, reducing the pay, making it a lower level, and potentially wrapping into that position education and work experience that would get them to the higher levels, right? So you're starting to use elements 2 and 3 of an apprenticeship where their pain point is finding a perfect match in recruitment. When we talk about work processes, right, that's the work process schedule, right, and the competencies of that work process schedule, and reaching full competencies in each. An employer doesn't know anything like that. What they know is, I have a job description, right? I've worked with my HR person, we've created a job description, and the position has responsibilities, right? And even on that job description, if we go down to the next element, I'm going to say on the job description what my minimum education requirements are. So they start describing the related instruction that's necessary for the position in terms of education minimums, right? I need a person with a CS degree, computer science degree, or I need a person who is a medical assistant and got a certificate program and actually got a certification in medical assisting. They'll put those on the job descriptions, right? So from the job descriptions, you'll start to understand what the depth of knowledge that's necessary for it. And if they can't find the individuals, that's another opportunity for you to say, hey, we can partner you up with some colleges, et cetera. They have this apprenticeship program, or they have this employee development program that will actually provide a person that's absent that knowledge, this new knowledge. Now, the last thing I found this 1 or 2 times where I've actually unintentionally frustrated the employer, because I actually started talking about all the training and onboarding that we could help them with for their employees, not knowing they had a fully staffed education and training department. And they already had all the related instruction. They already had an internal process to develop people. Right? They would bring them on, and for 9 weeks, they would be in this education. That 9 weeks is all the related instruction that's needed for the apprenticeship. So you make a tick mark there, but they talk about it as internal training, right? External training, they send someone out to a class. They talk about it as onboarding, right? We have an onboarding process. And those are the key terms you want to focus on, because they all become elements later of the apprenticeship. The on-the-job learning, they don't talk about that. They talk about mentoring, supervision of work, and performance reviews. And then finally, the stepped-up wages, right? They don't talk about a wage, a wage schedule, right? You'll never hear them. They'll talk about merit-based increases, performance increases. They'll talk about wage bands, right? When you talk about it with an employer, you'll have this conversation. You say, well, what is the wage band for this position? What's the minimum and the maximum of it? And they tell you that. And then you ask them, have you ever brought anybody in at the minimum? They usually say no. Usually it's at least 25% above the minimum. right? We try to get within that sweet 25 to 75% range of the band. Well, then you can actually start talking about, well, what about if you went to that 0%? What if you went to the very minimum, right? And you paid someone that and used the delta to educate them, right? So you start talking about getting their understanding of what it takes to build an individual and then bringing an apprenticeship after the fact. So I'm going to pause there. So it says, so we're able to communicate with employers. I'm looking at the chat with employers using their language to help explain to them. Right. Well, that's an excellent point, right? But what are the key message and benefits that help them see why that should be a lift? Really, it's the pain, right? It's getting rid of the pain. This is a question for Jonathan, right? The benefits are how do you reduce that? Because it's one of those, what else are you going to do? You have a posting there for, we actually got our first introduction to Dartmouth-Hitchcock's health system because they had medical coding positions open for over a year. And they had a 8-month backlog in being able to bill procedures. 8 months of backlog in an entire healthcare system because they didn't have medical coders who could code the reports and submit the invoices. Right? So the pain they were feeling was too great and they couldn't hire. So we came in and said, we can solve this for you. We can build those individuals. Now we had to convince them we could do it, but once we did, they immediately embraced apprenticeship. And that was our first session of 10. They have over 250 apprentices now in, I think, 6 different occupations. And it's a staple way of bringing on new talent within Dartmouth-Hitchcock Health System. So the latter two of these is speak their language, right? You have the stepped up wages. They talk about merit-based. And again, we talk about certificate of completion and national credential. They're going to care more about, can you get this person to full competency? Can I get them promotable to the next level? And that's how we talk with them. Our whole purpose of doing this employee development is so that you can have a career pathway for this individual. So once they reach full competency in the one position, you can move them to the next level. So I'm going to stop there. I've been doing most of the talking. Questions from the group?
Anybody have any questions about Jerry's discussion or any ROIs that employers can anticipate from apprenticeship?
Very quiet group after the holiday.
Jerry, it's Andrea. I have a quick question. So I'm wondering if you can give another example of a way that some of this language has worked with another employer. I'm thinking back to that kind of the five places on that diagram. Where is your biggest sticking point when you talk to employers? Where does that usually start to happen?
So after I do research, right? So I'm always doing research to figure out what their need is, right? So trying to get a landscape before I even go in to talk to the employer, right? And some of the sticking points are not about the actual words being spoken, but about who you're speaking, who you're speaking with, right? So it's so important that when you begin the dialogue, right? If you're going to be and speak with someone from HR, that you use a different, right, set of criteria for how you're going to convince them to do an employee development program than you would do an operations person. Because HR, right, one of the biggest sticking points is they say, well, I got the job description. It requires a bachelor's degree in computer science. It requires an associate's degree in engineering, right? It requires a medical assistant certificate from a community college or a program, right? A certificate program. And that individual has no power to deviate from the requirements of the job description, right? So in order to handle that conversation with the HR, you want to focus on what their pain points are. How hard is it, based on what's on that job description, are you finding it or how hard is it for you to find candidates that match that? And what you usually hear back, it's almost impossible. I can never make my operations manager happy. And that's where you start to say, well, maybe what we can do on one of our calls is bring in that operations manager and explain some alternative pathways for securing that talent. Because if that operations manager is willing to say, I don't need an associate's degree, but I need some college experience, maybe that's what they're really looking for. They want to make sure the individual is capable of learning, right? And many times an individual's college degree points to that fact, right? But there are other ways of assessing it. So you really want to take, that's the conversation with HR, right? So you want to, because that's a really big sticking point. This is what the hiring manager says we need. If you're dealing with a hiring manager, right? And then you're dealing with, issues of, let's say, the wage scale, because you're going to convince that hiring manager they can save in their budget wages for the individual because you're going to be paying them at a lower wage. They may come back and say, well, it's impossible. You have to pay everybody the same. Then you would want to have a dialogue about why apprenticeship, why this model of employee development. You're really investing in that person. You're just not paying them dollars. You're paying them with education and you're paying them with mentored work experience. And we can talk with you and your HR folks about why it is important and how many employers have embraced this model to pay at the minimum level of the wage band and that savings invested in the individual. Because they shouldn't cut that out of the saving, out of your budget. What they usually do, and we've helped organizations see this, is they just transfer the wages from a wage line item, right, to an education line item for that given year. So if you're budgeted for, let's say, $60,000 for a software engineer, but you can bring them in at $40,000, right? You're going to transfer that other savings of $20,000 to an education budget to cover, maybe a portion of it, 10,000 of it to cover the education that's needed by them.
That's really helpful context. So I know that we're at time, and during our prototype session, I'm realizing that 30 minutes might not be enough. But I'm wondering if we can just pivot and ask, are there any other folks from the audience that have any questions to help wrap us up?
Hey, Andrea. Hey, Jerry. This is Jonathan. I don't want to take up like everybody's time, but I feel like what I've heard about the arguments might be a good synthesis piece for this, which is like, I sort of hear the build versus buy mentality, like that mindset of building versus buying your talent pool really emerging in sort of all of the examples that you elevated, Jerry. And I'm wondering if you would agree with that, or if you would say maybe I'm off on that.
No, that's a phrase I constantly use, and that's what you have to. The culture is the culture one to build from within, or is the culture one to buy from without? Right? When you're buying fully competent, right? So one of the things, Jonathan, you're absolutely right, is to gauge the culture, and that's why I love to work with community colleges that have internship programs, right? And then work with the employers who are hiring the interns and figure out what the conversion rate is. And those conversion rates that are very high with employers are willing to build people, right? Or those that invest in OJTs, right? You may have an employer that every year comes to you and asks for OJTs, and you do it because they take the OJT, they develop the individual, and the individual remains with that employer. Those are the ones that are just right for apprenticeship because they believe in the build process of an individual versus buying them already fully competent. So, Jonathan, no, it's a phrase, right, that you have to, in these conversations with employers, you have to kind of pull out from them, right? You can't tell them, wouldn't you rather build than buy? You have to ask the probing questions to see what is their onboarding process. How much appetite do they have for a skills gap in a resume, right? And that will then position you better to place the employee development model called apprenticeship at their feet to say, we have a solution for you. And we have dollars to help offset those costs. Because it is an expensive proposition to build than it is to buy. right? At least up front, right? Many times when you buy talent, you think you're buying a red bicycle, but you might be getting a scooter instead. Right? On paper, it looks like a bicycle, but it may not ride like a bicycle.
I think that's actually a really great way to end this. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining on this very first one. This format is going to morph and change over time. Again, what we're really trying to do as part of this project is to create a community of co-learners, co-sharers in this work all around the concept of youth apprenticeship. It really works. It works to help build local economies. It works to help create pipelines into post-secondary options for young people, and it works to help address employer needs. Please note the chat box where Cassandra posted, join the free Youth Apprenticeship Works community of practice for those additional resources. We encourage you to use that community of practice space, not only to learn more, but to share. We're looking to see what else is out there in the universe and hoping that we can use that space as a really good virtual curation space. Cassandra, is there anything else to wrap us up?
No, thanks again, everyone, for joining us for today's session. These will be stored within the community site as well. So that it is free to join. You'll see a host of different resources about upcoming webinars, events, different virtual office hours, as well as just a host of information that will hopefully support you as you expand and continue your work in youth apprenticeship. And with that, I'll go ahead and close us out for today. Thanks, Jerry, so much for providing a presentation today on employer engagement strategies. Thanks, Andrea, for joining us and for opening us up today. And thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's session. Feel free to join us for upcoming meetings and sessions. I will make sure to send you out the invitations. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.